Welcome. My name is Heather Sims, and I'm going to take you through the session that we had this morning on assessment for learning and feedback online, which is a digital ACE, part of digital ACE series run by Holex. So some of you may already be taking part in the digital ACE project, and certainly we had a good turnout today. So the point of today was to discuss and share ideas between us, to see what colleagues are doing, current practice, and to look into some of the benefits and new ideas that are coming up. So we started off with thinking about the changes that have been happening this year and how at the moment we're all having to think of ways of moving forward. We're beginning to consolidate and understand a bit more about teaching online and assessing online. And at the same time, we have a lot of criteria that we're working towards to make sure that we meet, so that we get our learners through their assessments and gaining qualifications in the way that they would expect, and that we're also all benefiting from the possibilities that have come our way. So we started off with having a little thought about what tech means to each of us, and on the whole, it was very positive. A lot of the benefits coming out, the way that people can collaborate using technology, the ability to research things, setting assignments, being able to feedback promptly, all sorts of things coming out of there. And then it enabled us to move on to thinking about the different aspects of working online. And one of them in particular was collaboration. The fact that learners now will happily work together online. And somebody teaching art was explaining that over the time he has moved from having learners having lots of one-to-one sessions into much more of a group work time, where some of the group will critique others, and they have trained to be able to do that. So they have some criteria to work from, or may spontaneously give comments. And that has come up as well in other areas. Community learning mentioned using WhatsApp and a closed Facebook for this as well, so that learners can spontaneously make comments, but the tutor is in there and is monitoring what's happening. We discussed how we could set up flipped areas using a saving space. So that could well be a Padlet where learners can go and they can access the work that's coming up ahead of them. And by the time they reach the classroom, they've already done quite a lot of the learning and they're ready to discuss. Leading on to the discussion, the kind of language we might use, and the interaction between learners and the tutor. We talked a little bit about using video, and we also talked about audio, and particularly in terms of feedback, doing something like a mote or a quick screencastify, just a few, a minute and a half maybe of feedback for a learner. And one person mentioned the research which says that kind of feedback tends to stick very well. And so that's been taken up by her team a lot. We discussed then also the use technology to help us assess without learners necessarily being aware that they're undergoing an assessment. So playing games in particular, and allowing people to be anonymous, so that they feel more at ease to respond. And quite a few different areas came up, or tools that we could use. And so I'll just mention a few of them that came up. So Nearpod, Kahoot, WordWall, Edmodo and quizzes were popular ones. We also mentioned using polls and using Jamboard and whiteboard.chat. So all those areas. And also Active Learn. Those ones were all coming up as good suggestions. And also I think in this time where we've gone through quite a hardship in this year, the cooperation between people and the aspect of play is quite significant, and possibly a good change for people if they've been isolated, they're not interacting so much with others at home. Bringing in an element of fun, an element of discussion, something a bit lighter is definitely a good thing. And one of the team online was mentioning that his tutors had become a bit overwhelmed by the volume of people who've had difficult times over the last year and have wanted to talk about that. And so they had discovered that it was necessary to, yes, take on board a little of that, but also steer them into a group supportive relationship where they are focusing more on the work in hand, to create a balance there. We looked at self-assessment next. Aspects that we looked at was, or rather were really now, the things going on in the background that we would know when we walked into a classroom with people. A lot of body language would be happening. Things would be said quite naturally instead of the sort of setup of a meet. And those things are not necessarily communicated immediately online. However, some tutors were saying that learners were reporting back that they felt more confident online, that they felt they were actually getting to know people because of the structure of being in a meet where they felt they had to join in. We did discuss the ways that different people respond. There are those that give very readily, and those that will if they have something specific to say or they have some research to contribute, but then those that really don't want to communicate by speaking. And so then the need to have other channels, other ways that they can communicate. We looked also at ILPs and discuss other ways of getting an electronic ILP set up. In my own service, we do this with using slides. So we have a set of slides that learners can be given as an assignment, and then it's to and fro between the tutor. And we also then insert additional slides as needed. And so this has become a very useful working practice for our teams. We discussed also the discussions that need to take place often between a learner who has a feeling of what they'd like to achieve, but may not be realistic in terms of what is possible in the time span of the course. And so negotiating those initial targets, how important that is to have those discussions. And it was brought up that some people use Google Forms for that and are happy that learners then submit and get feedback from them, from the tutor, and they can follow up with discussion as needed. And that can be private so that they don't feel that other people are hearing what's being said. So this, following on from that, really was just a question in my mind about how easily learners are able to reach their tutor and say what they feel they need to say, how many routes, and also what do we equip them with? Do we provide them with the vocabulary and the phrases they might need? And one tutor was explaining that they actually provide their learners with the sort of questions they might need and a framework, particularly if they're going to be giving a critique of somebody else's work, what kind of thing they're looking out for, what to include in those questions. In this section, we looked at peer assessment, and I just mentioned Austin's butterfly critique, which you may know. It's if you haven't seen it, there's a lovely video, and I would recommend it. It's somebody who is encouraging primary school children to look at drawings already done, but suggest amendments, and they end up coming up with some really wonderful comments, and it does show the value of peer assessment quite nicely. So we discussed classroom management, which obviously is very important when you're online, making sure that everybody's heard, but also making sure that we still use a variety as we work. In my own case, I have to put in a huge word for the LSAs, our wonderful hardworking LSAs, who support in class, but also work one-to-one outside of the class, and sometimes with a small group. And they will be monitoring as things go through, and they might be troubleshooting with tech issues, or giving extra support, or assessing which learners are responding well, or which ones might need additional support. I think that's been phenomenal this year. We discussed also the way that learners are supporting each other at the moment. Once they are equipped with ground rules, so that they are really very supportive, very helpful to each other. And this has been a strength of online teaching. We had a very quick look at question types. Didn't spend a lot of time on this, but just to point out that there are so many sorts of questions that we can ask. And for many people who are using surveys, they would be thinking, well, which one shall I go with? There's a lovely way you can ranking questions, or should it be open text? And I would just want to give you a few guidelines in a moment about that. So when working online, one thing that is quite obvious is that we need to consider when to use targeted questions, when to use people's names, because it is easy to get somebody who isn't managing to respond, but who would like to. And if you ask a question without a name, there can be quite a pause while people decide if it's them, if they're going to respond. And obviously we may not be looking at the person on our screen. So good idea to use names as we work. Now these questions, which you may know from Bloom's taxonomy, are areas that we can elicit very easily to check knowledge, check understanding, and to see if people can do something. They are fairly straightforward, and it's easy to design tasks for people to carry these out, whether you're using Google Classroom, a Jamboard, or other methods, and also some of the applications that we talked about before. However, if you're writing, this is the slide I wanted to get to, which is that if you're writing for surveys, about a week ago, MailChimp came out with some tips, and I thought they were really useful. So one was about just making sure that you just have one question per question. So not double-barreled one where you ask two things in one question, and therefore the reply you get may be giving only half of the information you require. Or it just may be confusing for the learner to respond. And the second point, I think, about asking only what you need to know. I think it's so tempting, particularly when you start out and you discover how easy it is to make a survey, to keep going and think of more questions that you could ask. But nothing puts people off faster than having to do more than they need to, so keep it short. The other ones are obviously to read through, but making assumptions, I think that's incredibly an easy thing to do. And so it just needs checking that perhaps with somebody else, whether that one is, whether you are asking leading questions and making assumptions of your learners without realizing it. I'll come back to open text answers and ranking questions, and why it's suggested that you don't have too many of those in a moment. But coming to the higher level questions, I've taken these two photographs in my hometown of Aylesbury, and I've taken them because it struck me that one I've known forever, it's always been there, the one on the left. It's been like wallpaper to me for many years. And then the second one was put up in 2012. And they strike me as having lots of things in common and also lots of contrasts. And so ideal for a compare and contrast question for working out, you know, why they're there, who put them there, what the context is, what the historical context is, what they might represent, what values they represent, what could be there instead. So there's quite a range of questions that could open up by comparing things that are very close by. And that's one of the wonderful things that we can do using technology, using just the beautiful visuals that we can find. And so I use this in the presentation to generate some ideas. And I was asking a question about capturing the discussion. Somebody was saying that, yes, the discussion is wonderful. How do you capture the evidence? And so we were talking about using a Jamboard or recordings with permission, and possibly doing some audio on there. Different ways we could do it, or a doc. And yes, it may be that the written work is of a different quality, or you may accept different versions of what comes up, or perhaps by using the chat as you go, it could be that you build up your answers that way. So this slide actually, because it sort of integrates with what went before and what comes next, we didn't spend much time on, but just to remind you that we do have so many more options. So the time in between when you're flipping a class, when you set people into breakout rooms, or you set up a choice board where people are not all working on the same thing at the same time, or you use a service like BKSB. There are so many options now to give learners exactly what they need. So I'm just returning now to the ranking of the sorts of questions. And I'm sure you'll notice this from Bloom's taxonomy. These verbs, so justify, prioritize, rate, they are ones that he was suggesting would be higher order thinking. I hope I'm not, I am paraphrasing, but I hope that's not an offensive way of doing it. And yes, they do challenge, they're definitely coming into the challenge ranking. But if you have a look also now at Dr. David Brock's work, so reading Your Brain at Work, I think he's moved on a little bit from Bloom's because he's actually been able to look at the way what you ask taxes your brain. And some of these down the sort of priority ranking do tax because they are conscious ways of working. So when you're asking somebody to sort things or put them into a list of priorities, that is taking valuable energy from your brain. And when you think that a lot of the things that we do to get the actual going through the process of clicking and finding your way in, that's doing that too. You're having to make choices along the way. And so the reason that's there is just to as a reminder that our learners are already expending their energies and their thinking power before they hit the screen. And so just bear that in mind when they're being assessed, to make sure they've had time to relax. Maybe they've got a drink in front of them, or you know, the fruit or something, just to keep their energies up, and that they take breaks. We didn't have as long as I would have liked on constructive feedback because we spent quite a lot of time on the other aspects, but feedback did come up all the way through. And one exercise we did here was to think of someone who we all value very much in our lives and whose words we value, and then to come up with 3 words that describes them as people. And so we came up with things like they have sound knowledge, they're honest, they have a different worldview, they see the bigger picture, they have a sense of me, they have a sense of humor, they have integrity, they're non-judgmental, and all these qualities are what we need to have when we're giving constructive feedback, so that we see things from the learner's point of view, our own, And it may well be that we're also looking at the criteria that we need to match the work against. So when we're looking at feedback, we're really looking to help learners move on. We did look at things like feeding back via assignments and building in the groundwork so that learners are ready to take on that feedback, especially if it's coming cold and through a form rather than with the tutor's discussion. We looked at this kind of marking and scoring, and we basically said that although there is a place for it, particularly as you approach exams, and you may want your learners to know what they're up against and to evaluate themselves where they would fall in each category, there is a place for it. But on the whole, most people were saying that this has gone as a way of working, and they're using far more discussion and supportive work to help people move forward. And that referred to their OTLs and teaching ways as well. So this brings me to the end of the work that we did today. From my point of view, it was immensely enjoyable and valuable. We had some lovely comments, and we also opened a Padlet where people could share any ideas they had. And there were some super things that came up there as well. So a big thank you if you've stayed with me through this, and a big thank you also to Holex and to the work of the Digital ACE team. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.